Good morning, everybody. It's Pastor John with another edition of Monday Morning Quarterback. So yesterday we continued our sermon series on the 8th chapter of Romans called Romans 8, the sweetest chapter. And yesterday Paul draws this very clear contrast between life in the spirit, which is life, and life in the flesh, which is not life, it's death. And it's important to recognize, first of all, that, he does not mean those terms in the narrow sense that we might mean them. And so if you want to know more about what he means by life in the flesh and life in the spirit, then I encourage you to go check out the sermon, because there's more to it than just the simple meaning of those words. But what's important is that Paul drew a very sharp contrast between those two things. And for Paul, again, it is very clear that life in the spirit is life and life in the flesh is death. And I used the example during the sermon of the Victor Hugo novel Les Miserables, because Victor Hugo really drew the contrast between those two things in the characters of Jean Valjean and Javert. Valjean, would represent what I would call life in the spirit, and Javert would represent what I would call life in the flesh. And he, in that novel, these two characters, I consider to be sort of the moral foundation of the story. They are the two that really let you see the definitive character that Hugo was trying to paint, and the choices he's trying to paint. The choice between life one way or life the other way. Life in the way of Valjean, which is compassion, love, justice, mercy, and life in the way of Javert, which is, law, punishment, anger, and all those things. And so that's kind of where we were in the sermon. Now, what I want to point out to you is, while in the sermon, or in Paul's letter and in Les Miserables, those distinctions are very clear, almost absolute, if you will. It's very clear who is the protagonist, who's the antagonist. It's very clear who we should want to emulate and who we should not want to emulate. Okay, but life is not as clear. My son Corin was visiting us last week, and I was talking to him about my sermon coming up. And one of the things that he pointed out was that the book of Romans, if one of the frustrations people has in reading the book of Romans is that it seems on the surface as if Paul is kind of all over the place between the spirit and the flesh, between the law and grace. He just seems to be all over the place. It takes a more careful, thorough reading to really get an understanding of what Paul is trying to accomplish. And my son pointed out to me that if Paul is all over the place, that's kind of indicative of our lives, because our lives are all over the place. It never is a time, when we are all clearly in the spirit or clearly in the flesh. We all try to live our lives in the spirit, but we don't always succeed. And so the thing that I wanted to point out, and I told my son, I said, that'll preach. Thank you for pointing that out. Because what he reminded me of, and I didn't really have space for in the sermon, what he reminded me of is that whether you're living your life in the spirit or in the flesh, grace is present. So those moments when we are all over the place, those moments when we don't live up even to our own ideals, let alone God's ideals, in those moments, God is with us. And grace not only sustains us, it not only saves us, but it calls us forward to a new way of being. That's the whole point of grace, is grace provides unending opportunities for redemption. And that's the point. Because there are some times in my life where, to use my son's terms, I feel all over the place. My schedule seems all over the place. The things that I have to get done seem all over the place. Sometimes my emotions themselves are all over the place. And I would love to live my life in the Spirit as if it's this thing that I can just do clearly. But sometimes clarity itself is all over the place. And so it's important that we remember, as we talk about the law and grace, as we talk about the Spirit and the flesh, it's important that we do not make a law of these things, a dogma of these things. And remember that no matter where you are, grace is present. God's grace is present. And it's not measuring you. It's not judging you. But it is inviting you. It is extending the hand of fellowship and saying, "Come to me, all who are weary and carrying heavy burdens." It is saying, "I will give you life, and I will give it to you abundantly." Grace. Whether we are living our lives in the Spirit, or whether we are struggling with that, whether we are all over the place or locked in, God's grace is present with us. Thanks be to God. Have a wonderful week, my friends. God bless.